But what you're actually doing is you're sort of giving students the keys to a very fast car that they're not ready to drive. And so as you look at the way that cueing and look-say is taught, it actually leaves room for inaccuracies.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Narrative. Mike Andrews, David Mahan. We're joined today by Troy McIntosh, the Executive Director of the Ohio Christian Education Network, because we're going to take a deep dive into education topics today as part of the recent announcement of President Trump's executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. And we're going to try and do it quickly, Troy, because first pitch of opening day is closing in quick here. Yes. As big baseball fans. That's right. David has no idea what we're talking about, but it's baseball.
It's the Indians? What happened to the Indians?
I don't know if you
Only
can
in our hearts.
Yeah, that's right. Only in our hearts, and some memorabilia that is very valuable because they no longer are called that. That's exactly it. So we're going to talk with Jonathan Butcher from the Heritage Foundation about the executive orders, kind of the national impact of it. But Troy, this is going to have a big impact on what you're doing through the Ohio Christian Education Network and through the private schools that are part of that. So just start us off with, when you heard the news that this was official, that this had been signed, what were some of your initial reactions?
Almost like hallelujah, because this is, I think, one of the biggest changes in the educational landscape that we're going to see, certainly in the last several decades and even into the next several decades. When you combine the closure of the Department of Education with the rising tide of educational freedom and school choice programs across the country, I think what we're seeing is just a tremendous shift, a positive shift, in empowering parents and states to control the education of their children. And so I think this is great news. Certainly, I think you're going to hear from Dr. Butcher a little bit later in a little more detail about why this has such good, this is such good news. As it affects kind of schools and students in Ohio, a couple questions that I have been asked by parents and people who are curious about this. If a parent has a student who has a disability, I had a conversation with one parent who was extremely concerned because they knew a lot of the funding that their local district gets for their child who has significant special needs comes from the federal government. And so I think one of the things we want to assure people is that funding comes from an act of Congress called the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA or IDEA. That act actually predates the existence of the Department of Education by at least 5 years. That funding's not going away. I think what the president has signaled, as well as many of the kind of experts in education policy are saying, is that money's just going to be transferred to a different department. So the money will continue to flow to states for the education of those kids, because that's one area that the executive order explicitly protects and is protected by an act of Congress. It's just going to be managed under a different department. And so the benefit of the Department of Education going away, while it retains those vital aspects that the federal government, I think, constitutionally has the authority to engage in an education, while getting rid of all the extraneous stuff. I think one of the best explanation of how the department operates that I've heard was the department takes billions of dollars in funding through federal taxes out of the states. They scrape off a huge chunk of administrative costs and then hand it back to the states with a bunch of strings attached. That's essentially what they do. And so we now have the opportunity to keep that money in the state where decisions can be made at a more local level. I think almost everybody agrees that the more local the decision, the more effective and responsive it can be. And so I think that we're just going to see both short-term and long-term benefits from this executive order.
Yeah, and as it pertains to school choice in Ohio, since that's one of the big things that OSIN's working on, how is it going to benefit just the availability of more school options for parents in our state?
Yeah. So one of the EOs that was not as widely talked about actually was issued prior to the executive order to dismantle the department, was authorizing the federal formula funds that are given to states in the form of block grants. It explicitly gave states the authority to use that to fund school choice programs.
Right.
So Ohio currently receives several $1 billion a year from the federal government in the form of these federal block grants. And while they traditionally had all these strings attached to them on how they could be spent, some of those were removed by that EO, and the state now has the authority and the ability to use some of those fundings to fund like the Ed Choice scholarship program that Ohio has been kind of a leader in expanding. And so how the General Assembly and the Department of Education and Workforce decide to actually use that is still up in the air, but at least now they have the opportunity to use those funds to fund school choice.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And David, we're in that stretch of the year across the street at the State House where budget's all coming together, and there's a lot of chatter about what does this mean for local school districts with the way that they're trying to fund the Ed Choice program and stuff like that. But just in terms of what you're seeing education-wise in the budget, what kind of amendments have been discussed? Or Troy, maybe that's a better question for you, since David's got a deer in the headlights look, and anytime he sees a deer, he's trying to square that thing up in the crosshairs. But yeah, just what are you guys hearing across the street from the State House, whether in terms of what they're actually discussing, or David, maybe even in relationships with lawmakers that you're talking to about these things?
Yeah. So on education-specific issues, there are a number of things that we're actively pursuing. I think the General Assembly has been pretty consistent in how they've approached school choice over the last 20 years, and that is to incrementally expand the program whenever they have the opportunity. Now, they did a major expansion 2 years ago in the budget when they went to an almost universal Ed Choice program. Every student's eligible, but not at the same rate. So we would like to see that change so that every student's eligible for the same amount of funding. But that was a pretty aggressive expansion. What we're looking for now is trying to clean up some of the things that the last budget didn't address. And really, the research is pretty clear that school choice programs are most effective when the student has a full range of options available to them, and it comes with no or very few restrictions on them. The Ed Choice expansion that took place 2 years ago left out two of those options that students can take advantage of, and we would like to see those two options included in future school choice expansions. One option is homeschooling. A student who is eligible for an Ed Choice scholarship cannot use that to cover homeschool expenses. So parents are still essentially doing homeschooling out of their pocket. There's a $250 per family tax credit available to homeschool families right now. So one of the things that we are advocating for, and we have worked with a representative to amend the current budget bill, is to expand that homeschool tax credit from $250 per family for homeschool expenses to $250 per student. Now that still represents only a fraction of what the state would be paying if those students went to public school, but it is an expansion that I think would help students, particularly if a family has multiple children.
6 kids.
Like
for example.
You might know, yes. The second option that we would like to see Ohio expand to are non-chartered, non-public schools. So currently, if you receive an Ed Choice scholarship, you can only use that for tuition at a chartered non-public school. That's what the vast majority of private schools in Ohio, that's the category they fall under. But there is still this smaller group of non-chartered, non-public schools that have chosen not to have any kind of engagement with the state. The state doesn't have any kind of authority over them in any way.
They're off the grid.
They're off the grid.
Like David's
essentially.
property.
That's a great.
where he
that's
goes
a great
to kill
analogy.
stuff.
Yeah, we would like to see that option be available to students. So we have worked with Senator Romanchuk he actually introduced House Bill 68, which would authorize an educational savings account program for students to use at non-chartered, non-public schools. And then we have actually taken that, and with Senator Romanchuk's permission and blessing, and had that introduced as an amendment to the budget in the House. And so we're working to build support for that, and hopefully that makes it into the substitute budget bill that will likely be released next week.
Now, who could have done a better job of breaking down all that school choice stuff than Troy McIntosh?
Not you.
Mr. School Choice, right? Last real quick thing. Can we talk about what we're doing across the country in terms of ASIN, and just real quick?
Yeah.
It's exciting.
Yeah. So this is one of the big things that we're working on and really excited about at the Ohio Christian Education Network. Is we've grown in just a few years to represent 200 Christian schools across the state and over 55,000 students. And I think we've been able to see the positive effect of giving Christian schools a place at the table when it comes to education policy, because for years we didn't have that. When I was a school administrator for the bulk of my career, there was nobody down at the State House advocating for us. And so by establishing that and the growth of the network and the work that we're doing, I think we've been able to see a lot of the gains that we've seen in school choice and religious liberty and just mediation between our schools and the department has been the result of OSIN. So when I know a lot of school administrators from other states, and when I would tell them the work I'm doing now, almost invariably the response would be,
right.
Well, we need that in our state.
We get that here.
Yeah, because there are almost no other states have something like what we have here in Ohio. So we're going to be working in the coming years, and we'll have an official announcement out in the very near future about this. But we're going to be working to kind of export what we're doing here in Ohio to other states and helping other states stand up similar school networks in their states. So we're going to start with about 5 or 6 states for this coming year. And then once we get those established, we're going to continue to work to grow it out. And our ultimate goal is to have a Christian education network stood up in all 50 states.
Yeah, and
Nice.
David, I think it's worth mentioning too, with your background, you spent a lot of time in public schools. So when we talk about the failures of the Department of Education or just about the funding system, like you've had maybe more hands-on experience than a lot of people have.
It's
with that.
we see the data, but it's heartbreaking when you see these kids who know they're not getting a good education. I think the latest NAEP scores, 70% of kids, 69% of kids in 4th and 8th grade are not proficient in reading, just as bad in math. What are we doing, right? And so we may not all understand, the root of that issue, but we do have to understand that the Department of Education is not the solution. And if somebody's willing to take some chances and fix this problem, then let's do it.
Yeah, and I think that's why this conversation you're about to hear is so helpful. It gives you that context for why there are a lot of people celebrating it. I think it also gets into some of the issues of why people on the other side of the ideological spectrum aren't happy about it, but it brings a lot of clarity, and it's one that we're excited to bring to you so that you can understand it better and hopefully discuss it better with people who are talking about it in your circles. We're going to chat with Jonathan Butcher coming up next on The Narrative. Hey, Narrative listeners. Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian chamber of commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org. And we are back on the narrative. Mike Andrews, Troy McIntosh, David Mahan, joined now by Jonathan Butcher, who's the Will Skillman Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. He has researched and testified on education policy around the U.S., including testimony before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He's also an author, and his commentary has been featured on renowned news stations and broadcast channels. Jonathan is a leading expert in education policy and reform and has received numerous awards and recognition for his work. And we are so grateful to have you join us today, Jonathan. Thanks for the time and for being on the narrative.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, we want to just ask the big question after President Trump signed an executive order to get rid of the Department of Education. Is this a good thing that we are going to see the Department of Education dismantled?
It absolutely is. As a cabinet agency, the Department of Education has not fulfilled the goals that were set out for it in 1979, 1980 when it was created. The idea would be to streamline federal spending on education programs around the U.S., protect civil rights, and hopefully better organize the way that Washington would interact with schools around the country. Well, test scores have not improved, spending has not gone down, and the number of special interest programs has frankly exploded since the agency was created. And so what we have today is an institution that monitors any number of programs, so many, in fact, that there is not a report that I can think of that actually puts all in the same place, all of the different initiatives that the Department of Education is operating.
Wow. And yet, because it's got education in the title, there's kind of this natural defense from a lot of people to run to its defense and say, no, this can't go away. It's going to just destroy our children for the future. But yet we're not seeing any outcomes from the 40 years, as you said, that it's been in progress. So what is it about the Department of Education that has made so many people think that it's indispensable?
Well, they may think that it actually teaches classrooms or has something to do with local schools and what happens with instructional time, but it does not, right? The Department of Education doesn't operate any schools, doesn't teach any children. What the agency does is move money from the U.S. Treasury to districts and local schools, and it monitors and handles the federal student loan program. Now, for the first responsibility, moving money from the Treasury to local districts, the essential programs, and the president has said this, will continue. So Title I, for example, is money for children in low-income areas. IDEA is money for children with special needs. And like I said, the student loan program, all of those are going to remain in place, at least for now. And so there is nothing that's going to change in terms of the money being moved to schools. Now, it's important to remember how much money we're actually talking about. State and local taxpayers actually make up about 90% of the per student amount for every public school child in the U.S. That means that the federal portion, federal taxpayers, they only account for about 10%. But the amount of rules and regulations and oversight that comes from Washington is something that schools and state departments of education spend an extraordinary amount of time and energy satisfying, right? The threat of a dear colleague letter, for example, from Washington is always in the back of the minds of a district leader, feeling that they may have gone out of step with some sort of mandate from Washington. And if they didn't have to look over their shoulder at what Washington was telling them to do, I think that local schools and state officials would be able to better create policies for their students and their unique needs.
So roughly 80 billion dollars, and correct me if I'm wrong, flows through that particular department. And am I correct in saying that a lot of that money is coming from the states anyway? The states would just now retain those dollars and take care of a lot of those areas on their own. Is that correct?
You're exactly right. So if you look at the overall picture of how much money we spend on public education in the U.S., it's right in the neighborhood of about 700 billion, just south, I think, of 800 billion total. Washington, federal taxpayers make up about 10% of that. The rest of it, right, the vast majority is already provided by state and local taxpayers. But the portion, especially for children in low-income areas and for children with special needs, that's going to continue. at least for the foreseeable future. I think the ultimate goal for at least the vision that the Heritage Foundation has laid out is that those funds would be turned into a block grant and given to states to better determine how it's used. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about money for children in low-income areas, the Title I that I keep referring to, research on this program, it actually finds that it's not effective, right? If you look on a per student level, you're talking about maybe $500 to $1,000 per child. And in a place like New York or Massachusetts, where you're spending $20,000, $25,000 per child, right? That amount of money is not going to move the needle on whether or not a student learns to read. But what is going to move the needle is whether or not the state standards in those states are being pushed by Washington, right? To do something that state lawmakers know is not in the best interests of their students. That was what happened during the Common Core back in 2010 and 2012.
Jonathan, some of the conversations that I've had with people who would otherwise be kind of predisposed toward the elimination of the department is that they have children who have special needs, somewhere on the autism spectrum, developmentally handicapped, learning disabilities, so forth. And they know that a lot of the funding that a local district has to fund their special ed programs comes from IDEA funding and the federal government. So what would your response be? I know the executive order says that money will be protected because the idea isn't going away, right? So Congress is still obligated to fund that. But if the department goes away, how do you see the federal government handling IDEA funding?
Well, that program is one of the initiatives that should be kept and protected from the Department of Education, and it can move to Health and Human Services. I actually think that would be a good fit for IDEA. So in terms of whether the federal portion will remain, as far as the president's executive order has said, it will, right? It's going to still flow to states and local schools. Something I would remind parents, though, is that when they made their IEP, their individualized education plan, they didn't make it with Washington. Right? They made it with the local district. They made it with their local school. And so the services that are being provided to their child, that was done in coordination with their local teachers and administrators in their district. So, the major decisions about the services a child's going to receive, it still will be a local decision. I would point to states like Florida, Arizona, and even Mississippi, although Mississippi's program is quite small, where they have adopted what are known as education savings accounts, which are private accounts that parents can use a portion of their child's education spending, usually the state portion of their child's education spending, for education services for their child. In Arizona, you can use an education savings account and you can hire a personal tutor of your choice, an educational therapist that you select, right? This is very different than being assigned to a local school and then having to negotiate with that school about what services are essential for your child. And I think the examples that we have in states that have robust school choice programs shows that we certainly don't need Washington, and that it's going to be essential for state lawmakers in the future to be looking to help children with special needs through providing parents and their children with more private learning options.
For our listeners who aren't familiar with the IDEA Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's really kind of the federal act that kind of dictates services for children with special needs. An interesting thing to keep in mind for those who fear what the Department of Education going away would do is that act actually predates the Department of Education by 5 or 6 years. So, we have a history, we have something to look at about how IDEA can be implemented without a Department of Education in place.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And we also have examples of how states have really done a great job of helping these families by giving parents more options about, how and where their children are educated.
Yeah, far be it from me to be political here on the narrative, but as director,
aghast, David, I am aghast at you, sir.
As director of policy around here, we bump heads quite often with teachers unions, and who are known to support, both sides of the aisle to get a lot of their woke agenda accomplished. They want one side of the aisle to advocate for their policies. They want the other side of the aisle to just leave them alone and look the other way. How would shuttering the Department of Education impact, or maybe not impact, the influence of some of our teachers' unions?
Well, I think the unions have sort of tipped their hand because just a few days ago, earlier this week, they filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration's efforts to close the Department of Education. And without, I won't speak for them, but I will tell you that teachers' unions, they give nearly all of their political giving to left of center, right, causes and candidates. They advocate for programs that are actually quite unpopular. I'll name just a few because it's worth mentioning what the unions advocate for. In California, they actually advocate against phonics in reading. Right? They advocate for what has been a highly disproven method based on the look-say method of teaching reading. And that's just reading is essential and very important, but we haven't even gotten to the culture wars yet, right? I mean, they advocate for allowing boys to participate in girls' sports, giving boys access to girls' private spaces, advocating for radical racial causes through the form of critical race theory and things like that. So I think what is happening and what they see happening with the dismantling of the Department of Education is that many of their pet projects that gives them a reason to lobby Congress and raise money as a special interest group would be gone, right? It would make their job more difficult if they had to lobby more departments. I think they appreciate the idea that, there's one centralized place where they can go to try to get all of their objectives accomplished.
I.e. Title IX.
I mean, Title IX. I mean, you could even look. I mean, that in the culture war, I think you hit the mark. I mean, that's been the big one over the past year. But look, even at some of the other educational programs like Title II, which is money for teacher recruitment and teacher retention, it's highly ineffective. Even the organizations that like it and want it to continue say that it's not working in the way that it is put together right now. But unions can advocate for it, which, of course, if you hire more teachers, that then allows them to go and recruit more members. I mean, there are any number of ways that teacher unions can use the special interest programs through a big federal agency to advance their causes.
And one of the arguments that I think we hear pretty often here in Ohio is that, well, when schools aren't doing their job or aren't meeting their academic standards, they need more money. They don't have enough money to do it. And yet we see all this money flowing from the federal government to the states. And as you said, we haven't seen the academic improvement. So where is that money going if it's not actually helping in the classroom?
It's been to hire administrators. We have seen just a huge increase in the share of non-instructional staff who have been hired over the last half century. I mean, upwards of 700%, an increase of some 700%. Whereas the increase in teachers has been about 240%, 248%. The increase in students is right around 100%. So you have a modest increase in the share of K-12 students. You have a larger increase in the share of teachers, but then the share of non-instructional staff has simply ballooned. And there was a report just recently from Georgetown University and a researcher who's been looking at the way in which the federal COVID money that went to states for K-12 spending, the way that was spent over the past few years. And sure enough, the evidence is there that schools hired more administrators than instructional staff. And this creates a bureaucracy. It doesn't do anything to improve instruction in the classroom. Remember, the federal money we're talking $200 billion a year, right? On top of what the annual budget that comes from Washington is already. I mean, this is a serious increase in federal spending.
And what does that do to the overall cost of education in America?
I mean, look, we've gone from just in the past few years, jumped from about $12,000, $13,000 per child on average to topping out right around $16,000 to $17,000 per child on average nationally. Of course, it's going to depend on your state. I mean, there are places like I mentioned New York and Massachusetts earlier. I mean, especially in New England, right? You have pretty remarkable per student spending numbers. Even places like
Ohio, yeah.
No, I'm sure. I'm sure it's very similar. I was going to point to Baltimore, Maryland, where you've easily got north of $15,000 per child there, and yet there are some public schools in Baltimore where the students 0% of them are proficient in reading or math. Zero, none.
You mentioned block grants as being a way that Heritage is suggesting these funds that have been coming from the Department of Education be used. What other types of solutions could be on the table now that the Department of Education looks to be going away?
Well, the student loan program is so large and involves so much money that there has to be a very thoughtful solution about how to do two things. One, if we consider it an essential service for now, and of course there are millions of borrowers who are depending on that program, whether or not you like it, the fact is there. So that program should be moved to a place such as Treasury. Now, there's been talk recently of the Small Business Association, which is where current Education Secretary McMahon served in the first Trump administration. So she knows, that service SBA well. So whether it's small business or whether it's Treasury, I think that moving the loans to another location will be an important first step. The next step is going to be limiting the number of loans, reducing the number of loans, because right now we have simply too many ways for taxpayers to be put on the hook for college student borrowing. We have plans like the Parent Plus loan program, which can set parents up so that they will be paying for their child's college tuition well into retirement. So programs like that need to be closed. And then you can move things such as we were talking about IDEA and Title I, as they are block granted to states. I think we could also turn those into small education savings accounts or small individualized spending programs where parents could access their child's portion of the spending and just choose, right? If they want to hire a tutor, if they want to pay for additional learning experiences or something like that, that they would be able to do so. So I think these are some of the creative solutions we can do with the essential services. In the meantime, I think some of the programs that are just ineffective. Things such as 21st Century Learning Centers, which are an after-school program. There are some programs that are sound like identity politics, like education for Alaskan Native students or Hawaiian Native students, which are very small programs. There's already departments of education in Hawaii and Alaska that serve their students. So some of these smaller programs that are ineffective should be closed down.
So, Jonathan, what we've been talking so far kind of about the pragmatic reasons why the department should be dismantled. There's also this whole line of argument along constitutional grounds, questioning whether the department even has a constitutional justification for existing. Of course, education is not one of the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, that's granted to the federal government. And so the 10th Amendment, this is something that's reserved to the states and the people. So can you talk about pressing that issue a little bit? And then are there any legitimate functions that the federal government has in education policy?
Well, I can answer the second part of that question first. I think the issue of civil rights is essential, without question. I think that it is well within Washington's authority to protect civil rights and make sure that it is handled appropriately. So the Department of Education has its own Office of Civil Rights. That, I believe, should be moved to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice already manages investigations and charges around the issue of civil rights. I think that what the OCR in the Department of Justice, in the Department of Education, has become is a bit of a game of tennis, where one administration takes over and they issue a set of directives, and then the next administration will change them, and so you go back and forth, and it just becomes a matter of confusion. And I think you should move it to the Department of Justice and let it be handled there from one office. In terms of speaking of federalism or philosophically about the existence of this cabinet level agency, I mean, I think we have to remind state policymakers and parents especially that education is a state priority. It's a federal concern, but it's a state priority. It is in state constitutions, nearly without exception. So I think that by letting families know that they and local educators will have more autonomy over how schools operate, over the choices that they can make about what happens in a classroom, they will have more control over those things without Washington trying to decide for them. I'll give you a quick example for those who would say, oh, Washington hasn't done these things or hasn't been a problem. For those who can remember way back to 2014, when President Obama was in office, he sent a letter to schools all over the country, essentially saying you need to keep a ratio of the race of the students who you discipline. And if the ratio shows that minority students are disciplined at higher numbers than their white peers, that is evidence of discrimination, regardless of what the students did. Doesn't matter. Just if the ratios are off, and we will send OCR to come investigate you, and we'll threaten to take away your federal money. And this is the kind of thing that keeps district officials up at night as they think about Washington trying to micromanage how local schools and ultimately how order is maintained in classrooms.
Yeah, some of us in here are older than the rest of us. And I think, your kids are out of school, and you see, hear about all these executive orders, break this stuff and then we're going to build back better. But there are a lot of people who are really afraid, their kids are young. If it was that easy, everybody would be doing it, right? They've been talking about reforming the Department of Education since Reagan, right? If not before.
Yes.
So why should we believe that, in the 4 years President Trump has to get this thing done, that it will be done and then well enough to where it's not just going to be this half-baked thing that was started but never finished? Like, what kind of reassurance can you give our listeners?
Well, I think what we should look forward to is that, what will ultimately need to happen if we are to phase out and appropriately wind down things like Title I and move IDEA to Health and Human Services, things like that. There will need to be legislation from Congress. So at some point, there is going to need to be a bill. Absent that, though, okay, and in the meantime, I think what the Trump administration will be able to do will be to so minimize the footprint of the U.S. Department of Education in the 50 states that local officials will realize how little they actually needed the U.S. Department of Education if they don't already. I think that with the reduction in force that was issued just about 10 days ago, just about a week ago, we will start to see what the U.S. Department of Education actually did, and that they didn't need to have a staff that was larger than 4,300, right? Some people. I think that we will begin to see that states really can, right, operate without the oversight of Washington. Now, don't miss the overarching point here, right? It is still the fact that there are states all around the U.S. that are struggling with student achievement. I mean, we got the nation's report card just a couple of weeks ago. Reading is a major issue in most states, right? There are very few that showed any improvement. But the improvement that we're going to see is going to come from state innovations. It's not going to come from Washington. It will not come from the top down. It will come from states showing how they can move towards, say, the science of reading, for example, which includes phonics and moves away from this idea of look, say, and cueing, right? We'll start to see, and we are actually now, seeing how school choice can move from state to state without oversight from Washington. All of the school choice growth that we've seen across the country didn't come because of anything that Washington did, right? That was purely a state issue. What we know as the Mississippi miracle, right, with the improved reading scores in Mississippi, that came from, in part, private investment from a gentleman who retired to Mississippi and wanted to see the scores improve. What we've seen in social studies standards in places like Louisiana and South Dakota, right, where they have moved to a set of standards that actually looks at America as a place of great hope and opportunity, right? All of this came from states.
And Jonathan, you've mentioned it a couple times, so I'm guessing that you're familiar with this recommendation I'll make to our listeners for a different podcast called Sold a Story by American Public Radio. This is the story that kind of broke the literacy scandal that we've had in the United States, where schools and teachers unions have been dominated by people who have been following a method of teaching literacy. The Look-Say method goes by a number of different names, but that primarily came out of our hometown, Columbus, Ohio, at Ohio State University, with Professors Faunus and Pinnell here in Ohio State. And that method has just been devastating to literacy instruction across the United States as it's set up against phonics instruction. Fortunately, in Ohio, our governor has had the foresight to realize that the state has an interest in requiring schools to use direct phonics instruction in their literacy. And so we're seeing a massive shift here in Ohio, but there are still a lot of states across the country that are captive to the reading recovery Look-Say method.
You're exactly right. I mean, I mentioned earlier, California's teachers unions for 2 years in a row have opposed a proposal to introduce phonics back into the state curriculum there. So, yeah, I think Sold a Story is certainly worth a listen. And I think the history of the reading wars in the United States is actually quite fascinating. The research on phonics is remarkable, right? I mean, the evidence that we have that phonics is more effective than Look-Say is very strong, and yet there have been powerful forces, including the likes of Horace Mann from the mid-19th century, John Dewey from the early 20th century, and then, of course, teachers unions that followed, who still pushed the Look-Say, cueing, whole word
Publishing
methods.
Publishing companies that knew the research and continued to push their publications anyway.
That's right.
Right. So, I mean, you guys are nerding out on this whole look, see, say thing. But
And David doesn't even know how to read. We're touching a nerve here with him.
Stephanie, I want an HR write-up of Mike. I'm tired of it. But why? Why would they do that? Like, if they know kids are not learning how to read with this method, if part of that $80 billion, I guess, that flows through the Department of Education is for research and innovation. When they find out that it's not working, what is the motivation for, still pushing this failed methodology?
I think the big answer is that education is susceptible to fads. It just is, as different methods of doing a very difficult job, right? Teaching a classroom of 20, 25 very unique individuals how to do the same things. And when fads come along, they tend to ride the wave. I'll give you an example. I mentioned John Dewey's name here just a moment ago. As education in general became more progressive throughout the 20th century, they didn't like the methods of memorization, teacher-led instruction, and the sort of structure, right, that we would associate with, say, the one-room schoolhouse. They liked student-led, right, because it sounds better, right? It sounds like you're helping students to become more independent when they're younger. But what you're actually doing is you're sort of giving students the keys to a very fast car that they're not ready to drive. And so as you look at the way that cueing and Look-Say is taught, it actually leaves room for inaccuracies. There's a remarkable lack of precision in cueing, for example, and I think it goes throughout sort of many of the progressive methods. There are actual teacher manuals that say when you teach cueing, if a student looks at a picture and sees the word beneath it and doesn't get the word precisely right, but comes close, let's say they get a picture of a shark and they look at the letters and they say fish, they would still get points for that, right? Well, that's not reading, that's guessing, right? And this is the kind of thing that I think has fueled all of the opposition, and appropriately so, to cueing. But I think it comes back to a belief that if we put students in charge, or if we say that education should be student focused, that means that we should give students more autonomy at younger ages. And I think you're doing them a disservice, right? We need to be giving students the foundational blocks of the Western canon. We need to be giving them the fundamentals of the skills that they would need to progress through education and on into either the workforce or college. And I think that some of these progressive methods don't do so, and the evidence is pretty clear.
Yeah, in many ways, the reading wars, the fault line is progressive versus a conservative worldview, right? And a lot of education space is dominated by progressives. And so when they come to see the phonics method as, quote, the conservative approach, which it has for decades. I mean, I was in grad school at the height of the reading wars. When that came to be seen as the conservative approach to literacy, the vast majority of teachers had nothing to do with it. And there was so much money being made by the publishers. They had a vested interest in it. Teachers unions had a vested interest in it. Classroom teachers did because of their own biases and worldview. But we're definitely seeing a change in this, and we're seeing, in a lot of ways, a reaction to those kind of failed literacy methods.
Yeah, and don't even get me started on new math, because I've gotten in fights with my kids trying to take them through their math homework. That's not the way you do it. That's a whole nother story, different rant for a different podcast.
Yeah.
But it's an example, though. It's an example of how education becomes the place where political disagreements are had over parents wanting their children prepared for the future, and educators, experts, right, saying that it should be done a different way. And I think that is kind of the nature of K-12 public education in the United States. I don't think it's new that parents are debating, what's happening in classrooms. I think that this is a part we should expect, right, to have to advocate for our children and advocate for what is quality content and what is not.
Well, Jonathan, as we wrap up here, I know we've kind of laid the framework of what this could look like. And now that we've got the executive order, is there any kind of definitive next step that we can be looking for in this process, or is it still very much open-ended?
Well, I think with student loans, I think there are still some decisions to be made about where that will land. And again, whether it's Treasury or SBA, I think there's some serious consolidation that needs to happen in terms of what sort of loans and or grants Washington is going to offer in the future. I think the evidence shows that when Washington adds more money to the student loan program, college tuition goes up because colleges know that Uncle Sam and taxpayers will fill in, what students are not. So that'll be a big one. I also think that we need to reassure parents, right, that the commitment has been made from the White House that things such as Title I and IDEA are going to remain in place, and IDEA moving to HHS at least will be the next move for that program. So honestly, I'm looking forward to the new challenge of going to state superintendents, state boards of education, saying, okay, now you have the autonomy to make decisions without Washington looking over your shoulder. Here's your chance to give every child quality options, either through school choice or through a rigorous curriculum. So let's get to it.
That was my last question for you, Jonathan, was what can states be doing? What should states be doing in anticipation of this move by the Trump administration?
Well, they should be looking for rigorous curricula, whether it's social studies and history. There are states such as Florida. I mentioned Louisiana, South Dakota are great examples on that front of social studies and civics. When it comes to reading, we talked about Louisiana and Mississippi. Florida as well also has a reading retention law. I think that state officials should be looking to the states where things are moving, right, where there has been improvement. And they should be ready to understand that people will up and leave if they see consistent failure. And we should be telling parents, this is your chance, right? This is your chance to advocate on behalf of your child by taking them somewhere else if your assigned school is not meeting their needs.
Well, Jonathan, I'm sure you're going to be staying on top of all the changes that are coming. Where can people follow your work, or do you have any recommendations on how our listeners can stay up to date on any changes that are coming forward with this executive order?
You can find me on Twitter at @JM_Butcher. Our research on these topics is at heritage.org, and we'll have more coming on what the next moves are with this effort to dismantle the department. So stay tuned.
Well, greatly appreciate you, Jonathan Butcher. Thank you so much for joining The Narrative today. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.